Thank you very much, Mandy. Thank you, everyone, for coming here. I know this is a tense time, and there's a lot of things vying for everyone's interest. History is definitely not high on the list of burning topics right now, but hopefully by the end of my talk, you will be convinced that history actually matters, and it shapes very much the reality that we deal with today. And because of that, I actually am going to start from the present. So this week, in the wake of Trump's, forgive me for saying stupid, declaration about Jerusalem, Palestinians all over went on demonstrations, their supporters around the world, and this included also Palestinian citizens of Israel. Today, in response, the Israeli Defense Minister, Avigdor Lieberman, called on the Israelis to boycott them. Stating, quote, "These people aren't part of the state of Israel, they aren't part of us," end quote. And although he's specifically talking in this particular instance about what he called rioters, this is a sentiment that has been expressed not only by him, but by several others of the current government in more general terms. And this challenge to Palestinian citizens' place in Israel and their right to and within the state, the Israeli state, is not new. It has been a part of Israeli policy towards them since the earliest years. And here I'm speaking about a community that today is 1.8 million, about 20% of Israel's population. This population is basically what remained of the Palestinians within the state of Israel, who were in 1949 about 150,000, and the number is very contested and fluctuant, but they are the only Palestinians who were able to remain in their land after the Nakba. So I talk today about Nazareth as a case study of this community's history. And rather than beginning in 1948, I actually explore the Mandate period. First, I insist on a continuity of Palestinian history, i.e. rather than the standard narrative that writes Palestinian history as a two-part history, as a history that is truncated, that either starts or ends in 1948, and as a result, Palestinians who become citizens of Israel become Arab Israeli, quote-unquote, which is the term that Israeli government actually worked very hard on creating, because that meant that they would be stripped of national rights and historical claims to the land. Rather than that, I actually try to highlight that despite the significant structural changes, i.e. despite the move from a colonial state or informally mandate, but really in practice colonial state, they are now in a nation state that is a settler colonial state. The structures of exclusion that Palestinians faced in the mandate period continued to be within the nation state, albeit in different forms. And in light of these exclusions, Palestinians who became citizens of Israel built on strategies and identifications that they used during the mandate period to undermine, to challenge the new self-identified Jewish state. So I begin exploring some aspects of the social and political life in Nazareth during the mandate. I will speak briefly about the occupation in 1948 and its significance and the challenges the city faced. And then I will, while placing the city in the wider context of Palestinian citizens of Israel, I will speak about how they went on to negotiate their incorporation into this exclusionary settler colonial state. So I start with the mandate period. So many of you can easily assume that when you hear Nazareth, there's a sense of this city that is holy and that has always been there since Christ. Even though there has been historical presence in Nazareth, their city, because it is nested in this geographic area away from the route of transportation, was a small and negligible place until the 18th century, when Dahir al-Umar, the Ottoman semi-autonomous ruler of the Galilee area, made it into his center. And with the security that he brought and the economic interest that he had in the city, in Nazareth, it began developing into a more substantial city. This trend continued with other Ottoman governors, and in light of the religious significance of the city, now with the newly gained security, scores of religious institutions, Christian religious institutions, started functioning in Nazareth in the second half of the 19th century, also basically helping to increasing the size and significance of the city. During the Mandate period, which started in officially 1919, but with British occupation of Palestine in 1917, the city actually continues to expand and continues to develop, especially because it becomes an administrative center for the Mandate authorities. But it still was a smaller urban center for the Palestinians compared to Haifa, Jaffa, Lidda, Jerusalem, and others. The city had limited economic resources. It was very much a city of its hinterland. It was very connected to the agricultural area around it. It had limited industry. Noteworthy tobacco factory, the Arab Cigarette and Tobacco Company, which was one of the largest in the country, and several quarries and small workshops. Most of the people employed in the city were actually either worked for the British administration or worked in Haifa in the refineries, in the railway workshops, and in army installations. This work power, this paid labor, actually increased significantly in the 1940s, not only in Nazareth, but in Palestine in general. By the beginning of the 1940s, Palestine was devastated by the Arab Revolt, which lasted from 1936 to 1939. The community not only had the economy been completely undermined by British brutality in response to the revolt, but the Palestinian leaders were also all absent, as they either fled or were exiled by the British. So the Palestinians begin the 1940s in a very hard time, but very soon after, because of British wartime policies, their economic need, as Palestine was their second center in the Middle East, there was an expansion in industry and expansion of employment related to the military presence. And in this context, there's an increasing labor mobilization in Palestine, a flourishing labor movement begins developing in a very forceful way. And in this labor movement, Nazareth plays a significant role, which is actually quite significant because if you think about it, this is a smaller town with a mostly traveling or commuting labor power, but it still becomes very, very active in the national scene. And the union is the first union is established in 1942, the most significant one in the city, جمعية العمال العرب الناصرة, as a branch of a national movement, but affiliated with the left wing of the Palestine labor movement. It becomes very active and militant very, very quickly, and in their mobilization, they tie very, very clearly the local and national. For them, because the everyday reality of Palestinian workers was very tied to the reality as people under British imperialism as they defined it, every aspect of life was tied to the national question. Because workers' everyday life was shaped by that, the labor movement needed to be a part of the nationalist movement, not only work for floor shop issues, which is what the British had intended for the labor movement to do. They are very, very active and very forcefully outspoken, in their mobilization. So, for instance, when the Anglo-American Commission comes to Palestine to decide on the future of Palestine, they call for boycotting it as an imperialist scheme. or in other cases, they support the nationalist movement when when a representative of the Palestine labor movement goes to an international conference and succeeds in undermining the Zionists' claim to represent the labor in Palestine. Nazareth throws him a party and a big celebration. So this is a very active movement that is very, very conscious of the national situation, very involved in it. But this was not the only avenue that Nazareth was involved in the political life in Palestine. And one of the important questions that the Palestinians faced throughout the mandate, but in more significance in the 1940s, is the question of local government. So for those of you who don't know, mandate is a term that was created by the League of Nations under the premise, basically, that the mandate authorities will help the people of the not yet fully there Middle East to develop until they are able to govern themselves and be independent. The mandate in Palestine, of course, had a little bit of a twist called the Balfour Declaration, because in this commitment to self-governance, the British included in the mandate document their promise to the Zionist movement of a Jewish national home in Palestine. So under this situation, even though the British promise advancing autonomy and self-governance for the Palestinians, they actually never followed through with that. Even their own commission, the Peel Commission in 1936, basically says nothing has happened. This needs to be addressed. But in this context, there is limited self-governance through municipalities. The municipalities are highly controlled by the British, who can appoint the mayor. So the council is elected, the mayor is appointed by the British, who were not bound by the elections. Budgets and all other considerations were basically under supervision of the British High Commissioner. Not only that, the self-governance aspect was even more undermined by extremely rigid, limited voting rights. The only people who could vote in municipal elections, which I would like to make clear, were the only context in which Palestinians could vote, because the British administration, under Zionist pressure, refused to allow for a representative institution in Palestine on a national level. You can guess why, or I will state it. The majority were Palestinians. Any representative body would have had to be a Palestinian majority, and the Zionist movement was not interested in that democratic process. But in the local councils, in the context of local councils, the only voting rights were for male over 25 who paid a specific sum in local taxes. The practical significance of that meant that in Nazareth in 1946, 8% of the population could vote in the elections, in the municipal elections. Even with those limitations, the British also engaged in a divide and rule policy, which was very much a banner of their governance throughout the world, throughout the empire, throughout the world. So they tried to basically divide the Palestinian community into different groups. In 1927, the municipal franchise law actually divided the representation on communal basis. So basically, it's supposed to bring a proportional representation for each community. In the 1946 elections, 1934 and 46 were held according to a new law, the municipal ordinance, and that one canceled the communal division, but did area-based division, which de facto was also a division according to community-based lines. So when the elections come in the elections were in 1934. They were supposed to be held again in 1939. The British prevent the elections by stating that this could jeopardize the situation during the war. So for 10 years, there's no elections. When the elections are announced in 1940 to be held for 1946, very, very significant mobilization begins. Begins within Nazareth to demand democratization. So that very active labor movement comes in again. They basically come out and say, if we are the people, if the workers are the majority of the people and they have no access to the governance, then how is our interests going to be safeguarded? And particularly in Nazareth, where the municipality was very much failing to do much. The city was in not a great situation. A part of my book also talks about the water, which I'm not going to get a chance to talk about, but I'm happy to answer questions. So the city is having water shortages, no development projects, failing infrastructure, and the labor movement basically spearheads this campaign to say, we need a local government that represents us. Because that's the only way this city is going to improve for all of us. And that's the only way for Palestinians to be in a better situation, to have some autonomy, so that until they get independence. That doesn't work very well. The British don't respond to that. The elections are still, as I mentioned, held in a format that only 8% of the city's residents can vote. And yet, in a surprising way, the elections are held very much in a public arena, the contest over the elections. And that is because of the work of the left organizations in Nazareth, the labor movement, and then other organizations, including the League of Arab Intellectuals. And what these organizations do is that once the elections are announced, and this is organizations who could not run for the elections because they didn't make the cut for the voting rights, but what they do is basically turn those elections into a national question, not a local question, and highlight the importance for the Palestinians not to fall into the trap of sectarian and family division, but to actually focus on the fact that you could that Palestinians could only get the rights if they're able to mobilize this limited space in order to push for expanding this space of democracy and self-governance. So I'm quoting, they say basically so they call basically on people to choose the right candidate. And they say that the right candidate will enable us, quote, enable us to continue struggling from within and outside the council to expand our liberties, end quote. And for that, they call on the voters to give their votes to qualified candidates based on the program they present, leaving personal interests and goals behind, end quote. So for them, the framing of the elections in this relatively small city that are very much structurally built to be sectarian and familial, to basically increase tensions among the Palestinians, are now an opportunity to try to unify people for a national interest. The union also calls on people to vote for a public interest, national interest candidate. And they say it very, very forcefully, the leaflet on the left, I'm translating, quote, give your vote to whomever you find qualified to serve the interest of your town. Release yourself from the confines of sectarianism and family loyalties, za'iliyah, and give your vote to the candidate who is loyal to his town and homeland. So again here, the intimate connection that is created between the national and the local is very much central. Even though the elections, the lists or the candidates that ran in the elections, because it wasn't party-based, were very much sectarian and family-based, they also join the frame. And here I want to stop for a second and talk about this idea of sectarian, because we assume this is Muslim against Christian automatically. But what the dynamic in Nazareth were never actually that. It was traditionally Orthodox Christians allying with the Muslims of the eastern neighborhood, al-Hara al-Sharqiyya, which is the newer and less affluent neighborhood, against the Muslims of the western quarter or the old city, who were more affluent, land-owning, traditional elites, who allied with the Western sects of the Christianity, Greek Orthodox and Greek Catholic and Roman Catholic mainly. But even in that, there is this interplay of the leadership of the city that is very much elite-based. even if it masquerades as sectarian or family. It's basically who gets to lead the city in this question. But even in that, the other candidates are compelled to engage in the nationalist discourse. So one example is Amin Jarjura, who was one of the Greek Orthodox candidates, publishes a leaflet. He actually acknowledges the elephant in the room. He basically addresses, quote, Western and Eastern neighborhoods and Muslims and Christians. So basically making it clear that this is the kind of way he's thinking about the world. But he says he is he's far from any personal, sectarian, or familial interests. In that context, he highlights that what they should vote for him for is because he is, quote, because of his, quote, persistent nationalism and resolve to work for the public interest. So again, even though pretty much everyone, we can assume, around knew what was at stake here for the candidates themselves, they all have to speak in this public context. And again, remember, 8% of the city can vote. So the idea that all candidates have to actually publish leaflets and address the public and address nationalist questions that are on the agenda on the day proves that the nationalist issue was at stake in Nazareth. And that was in everyone's mind, which of course is natural. We're talking about 1946. The Anglo-American Commission has actually already been in Palestine, gone through Nazareth, and violence is escalating by the Zionist organizations. The boycott, the Arab boycott call from the Arab League of Zionist interests has already been issued. But in that context, it is very important to remember that there is basically an attention that surpasses the structural limitations that are imposed by the British, that basically forces anyone who wants to contend for leading the people to actually lead the people in a wider sense, not in a Nazareth sense, but in a national sense. The elections themselves eventually seem to have fallen on sectarian lines or communal, familial lines, but actually never get resolved because one of the parties appeals against the elections results, initially through bureaucratic lines, then through British courts, and eventually even through mediation through the Palestinian nationalist movement when they, in December 47, turned to the Palestinian nationalist movement saying that the national situation right now does not bear continuing this conflict. We need mediation to end this so that we all can be basically on the same side. And this agreement actually signed 3 days after the partition plan is adopted by the United Nations in November 29th, 47. Eventually, the British district commissioner invites one of the candidates who won the elections, appoints him as a mayor, Yusuf Fahoum, 2 days before the British leave the country. He appoints him, and he appoints a council that is 6 of the elected members and 2 added members. Very close to the recommendation of the Palestinian mediator, the Palestinian Nationalist Movement mediator. I'll move to talking about the Israeli period now, or 48 and later the Israeli period. But I will start by saying that internal dynamics and local developments were hindered by the outbreak of the war. So, as I said, this was a commuter worker population, and the roads are pretty much shut down very early on after the beginning of the Civil War in 1947. So the workers in Nazareth no longer have access to work, and the city becomes a center for refugees as the Palestinian cities and towns are devastated and their population displaced. Thousands of refugees come to Nazareth, upwards of 20,000 according to one estimate, and the city has to deal basically with the this is now a good time for this slide, sorry. The city was, as you could see, 15,000 people, and it had more refugees in it at some point than there were residents in the city. There's a need for provisions, for services, for places for these people to live, and it's a very big challenge in the city. The number of the refugees will actually go down as some are allowed to go back to their towns and villages, others are resettled in other places, and eventually only 5,200 refugees stay in the city, about 20% of its population. So the city was occupied in July 16th, 1948. There was a force of the Arab army, and irregular Palestinian fighters in the city for months at this point, but the regular army, the LII, leaves the city right after Safuria falls, and the mayor decides that the city cannot fight. So the mayor and dignitaries go and sign a surrender agreement with the Israeli government. In the surrender agreement, the Israeli government commits to preserving Christian holy places in the city without any mention of Muslim holy places, and full and equal civil rights for the residents of the city. If any of you is interested, there's a brilliant scene in a film by Elia Suleiman, The Time That Remains, of reproduction of this surrender scene. That is a little of a comical twist, but it is very telling of the power structure of a city that basically has now, at this point, to remind you, most of the Palestinian cities have fallen under Israeli control. Haifa has been depopulated, Acre, Tiberias, Safad. So this is quite a traumatized population, not only by the strains on the city from the war, but also by living the experience of all those whose lives have been shattered, who now have turned from regular people who had homes and hopes and dreams to people who now lived in a limbo of refugeness. And in this context, basically, Nazareth becomes the only Palestinian city that survives, and as such becomes the social, economic, and political urban center for the Palestinian citizens of Israel. And in this transition from a more marginal place in the grand scheme of Palestinian politics to basically a central place in Palestinians' experience within the state of Israel, the city becomes very, very significant, because for the Palestinians it becomes the leading city. And the city's leaders basically take upon themselves to speak for the Palestinians. For the Israeli state, the city becomes basically the playground of control over the Palestinians. It becomes central in their policies towards the Palestinians, so much so that Israeli Orientalist Jacob Landau says, and I quote, "All political parties in Israel are well aware that the political mood in Nazareth determines to a large extent the political behaviors of Arabs in Israel." So the city becomes very much a fixation in Israeli program of controlling the Palestinian population. But before I move on to talk about that, I'll try to describe a little bit about how this city looked like right after its occupation. So as I mentioned, thousands of refugees in the city, sleeping at this point in monasteries. Basically, all the monasteries and all the schools in the city are full to the full extent, with as many people as they can put, and then people are forced to stay in shacks in the street. The city has shortages of water and electricity and fuel and food. And of course, as I said, in this trauma. But in addition to all that, in October 1948, Israel places the Palestinian citizens of Israel, most of the Palestinian citizens of Israel, under military rule. And this is in the areas that are majority Palestinians, which are the Galilee on the top, the Triangle, and the Nakba in the south. And what this military rule meant was that a military governor controlled every aspect of your life. All movements, all employment, all political freedoms are controlled by a military governor. And under the military regime, Nazareth, everything in Nazareth was very limited. There were curfews that went on from 8 p.m. to 10 a.m. Every day. There were raids into homes repeatedly and neighborhoods, looking for infiltrators, quote unquote, that is, people who were forced to leave their towns and villages and returned, and search for people who allegedly cooperated with the Arab forces during the war. There was also a dire economic situation. As I mentioned, high employment was rampant, already by the fact that people could not access their work in Haifa, but then add to that all the thousands of refugees who were either employed in those cities or were peasants, agricultural workers who no longer had access to their land. So by March 1949, 3,000 people were looking for employment in Nazareth. In this context, what do people do? Is one of the things that my book is mainly focused on. How do people respond and how do people survive this? Now, of course, Nazareth is lucky in the grand scheme of things because it was not depopulated. And one of the questions that has been raised repeatedly is why did Nazareth survive? Why was Nazareth spared the fate of Haifa and Lidda and Ramle and Jaffa and Tiberias and Safad and the 530 other Palestinian towns and localities that were depopulated? And my answer is we really will never know. One aspect of it is that it's a Christian city. This state that is brand new, has not received UN recognition, believed that Christians in the world are looking at Palestine and looking specifically at this holy place. So the image of this new state is actually at stake in part. There's even a part of the order for the army that went to occupy Nazareth that basically mentions that. But there's also the fact that the mayor surrendered and the city didn't fight, which probably helped. And he was a pragmatic leader. He kind of gave and talked to the people. And there's even the military, there's also the communists, for instance, from oral histories that I collected, said that they actually stood at the exits of the town and prevented people from leaving and went from home to home and told them, you see what happens to people who leave their homes, so stay put. And the military commander, who is actually a Canadian Jew who came to volunteer in the war, Ben Dunkelman, argues that he actually received orders to depopulate Nazareth, and he refused to. And eventually, basically, it went all the way up to Ben Gurion, and it was prevented. But so now that the city isn't physically survived, most of it, at least 80% of the residents remain in the city, they have to kind of figure out how to live. So there is an Israeli interest in resolving the crisis in Nazareth, because again, they believe the world is looking, and it doesn't really look very good if this holy city is in such a shattered situation. So they move on to meet with local leaders to try to return things to normal, as the Israeli officials called it. And they start trying to kind of resolve some of the basic issues, the overwhelming overcrowding, the unemployment, the food and water shortages. And in this, they basically begin a conversation with the local leaders. And those are a very wide range of people. There's the mayor and the municipal council. There's the religious leaders, who are also a part of running events in the city. There's the communists, who were in the labor movement and in the other groups that I mentioned, who are also now become very, very active. And there is also just civil society or civil servants, high school teachers and principals and all those. And they're all meeting initially with the basic idea of resolving the immediate crisis. But as time goes on, the conversation shifts. There's now kind of a move to what next. And the Palestinians in Nazareth, the Palestinian leaders in Nazareth, move to talk about how are they going to fit within this state. The communists are very, very forceful about it from the beginning. Even in the first meeting with the Israeli Minister of Minorities, which was 3 days after the city was occupied, they're already saying Israel needs to fulfill its promises, which basically means the equality that was promised in the Declaration of Independence. And the municipality very, very soon becomes the center of the contention. Because for Israel, Palestinian municipalities, only 3 survived, but then they have to start creating local councils, and those become a part of the system of control that Israel is trying to create over the Palestinians. But that doesn't really work out in Nazareth, because even the mayor, who was willing to basically sign the agreement, the surrender agreement, and talk to them at the beginning, he very, very soon becomes very hesitant to fully follow their orders, and he challenges them repeatedly. But to make things worse, the communists, now very outspoken, start demanding elections. And in demanding elections, they make it very clear that this is political. It is not a bureaucratic, technocratic struggle over this. This is political. And this is about the Arabness of the city, and this is about the rights of Palestinians within Israel. And that doesn't really sit well with the Israeli leadership, because for them, one of the big projects was to prevent Palestinian local councils from becoming politicized and from creating leadership on a national scale. So what this basically ends up meaning, sorry. I don't know why I just did that. This is the people I'm talking about that become very, very significant in this struggle. So for the next 6 years, from October 48 is the first record I found for demanding municipal elections, until 1954, there's a big campaign led by the communists, but later actually joined by pretty much every part of the city. And this is people who are not very friendly, but they all come together in demanding elections. And Israel is eventually forced to allow elections in Nazareth after the second round of municipal elections is scheduled in Israel, in Jewish towns. And after a mounting campaign. But even when they do that, even when they agree to schedule elections, they basically move on to make them into sectarian elections, to kind of continue the mandate policy of divide and rule, to make sure that what these elections are about are which family and which sect you are from, because if you're involved in that, you're not thinking about the larger picture. You're not thinking about Palestinians and their place in the state. You're not making this municipality into a political challenge to the Israeli presence. But it's not very easy for them, because if you remember, the alliances in the city were not very neatly structured according to these sectarian and family lines that the Israelis were trying. So they really have to work very, very hard for several months, pressuring this group and pressuring that group, and getting their men involved. There's, for instance, two Knesset members in the first Israeli parliament. 2 of the members were from Nazareth, Saifuddin Zabi and Amin Jarjura. And they pressure them to kind of pressure their communities. They put pressure on employees, government employees. And they kind of try to even financially help the lists that are created. And in face of this effort, Maki actually attempts to go against this divide, and basically tries to remind people of the big picture. They just constantly say this sectarian and family division is a program of the Israeli government to prevent you from your rights, to continue the oppression of the military government, to continue preventing the refugees to return, and all these aspects. This is not, again, very similar to the discourse from pre-48. This is not about the local, narrow family and communal interests. This is about the nation. And eventually the state actually gets some success. They're not very happy about the results because instead of one list for each, there is actually 8 groups vying for the votes. 3 Muslim, 2 Greek Orthodox, and 1 for the Western Christians. The 2 others are Mapam, which is another, at the time, left opposition party, and the communists under Maki. And once the lists are published, Maki goes on in a much more vigorous campaign to call for the vote and to insist on the national significance of these elections. For them, this is not about Nazareth. This is about the 150,000 Palestinians who are now in this state and who basically are facing military government, are facing still the threat of expulsion, are still facing Israeli brutality on a daily basis. And in this context, to highlight that, they even go so far as to stress, quote, "The issue now is not representation of a certain sect or a family in the municipal council. The issue now is saving the whole nation from new massacres and new displacements." This is 1954. The idea that bringing the Nakba into the story is a reminder for the Palestinians that remaining in their homeland is not to be taken for granted, that it's still a challenge, and that all aspects of Palestinians' life need to be directed towards that, toward guaranteeing this steadfastness, if you will, this insistence on being there, on refusing to disappear not only physically, but also on a national and political level. Not only were they going to be citizens in the country, but they were also going to be Palestinians. And this is kind of the constant tension, the constant struggle for the Palestinian citizens of Israel, not to turn into quote-unquote Arab Israeli, this new identity that Israeli security forces were trying to create, as Hillel Cohen showed, not to disappear, but to actually continue their presence in their homeland as Palestinians, while also guaranteeing their rights as citizens in this new state that is very much trying to exclude them from that citizenship. And in light of that, in light of the still extremely high unemployment, in light of the military government that was making life so hard for people, in light of the poverty and the oppression that people faced, the sectarian and family lists, which were very, very clearly self-identified as sectarian and family lists, had to join the conversation on similar level. They also had to speak in the name of the national good, in the name of protecting the good of the people. So, for example, one group that called itself Al-Ahliya, the popular list, starts its leaflet by saying, "We are the representatives of Western Christian sects." So it's clearly identified as a sectarian list. But then it moves on to also make similar demands to what the communists were demanding. We want the end of the military government, and we want the return of the refugees. Even though they frame it in a kind of a more local way, they're still speaking in that level, in that register. They even go as far as to say Maki is a creation of the government and it's doing its work, even though they kind of were themselves, and they knew it. But again, like in the mandate period, this public engagement is indicative, in my opinion. It is indicative of the fact that for these very, very clearly local sectarian groups, so local sectarian and familial groups, it was obvious that the public opinion demanded a stance that was actually tied to the national interest, and that made them, allowed them basically some expression of rights and an expression of their Palestinianness. And in light of that, the others had to basically join the conversation on the same level. How am I doing with time? So the elections finally happened in 12th April 1954. Despite all the efforts of the government, because the government doesn't just stop after the lists are created, they continue pressuring people to continue try to mingle, they continue try to scare, they also try to tempt. So they loosen up a little bit of the military government restrictions in Nazareth to basically use it as a propaganda tool. And all that effort and all the sectarian appeal and all those attempts, the communists actually have a resounding success. They win 6 out of the 15 seats in the council. So they're the biggest group, and they only need one more person to join their coalition that they can make have the mayor, and that drives the Israelis insane. You see the anger screaming out of some of those documents. How did this happen? Whose head needs to be going? And the Israeli officials go on to do everything possible to prevent the communists from leading the municipal council. They pressure the groups. And again, this is, one of the side effects of developing all these egos of those people that you want to be the sectarian leaders and the family leaders is that then you need to also try to get them to work together. And you need, of all the people who were elected, you need basically most of them, 7 of them, to give up so that one of them, or 6 of them, so that one of them can be mayor. And that proves to be very, very hard in this context. So they try very, very hard, and even to the degree in which at some point the communists actually succeed in convincing one of the Greek Orthodox representatives to join them in the coalition, and they're physically prevented from reaching the municipal council. Dozens of people from the Zerbi clan, relatives of Saifuddin al-Zerbi, who was one of the government people, show up in Nazareth under the military government. Remember, to go buy vegetables in the next nearby town, you needed a permit. To actually go see a doctor, you needed a permit. But dozens of armed people show up in Nazareth. They're armed with sticks and things like that, not weapons, come into Nazareth and prevent the communists from physically arriving to the municipal council. And the police doesn't do anything. The meeting is eventually canceled, giving the government enough time to pressure everyone. And eventually, in July 1954, a mayor is agreed upon. The story doesn't end there. The tension, the communist insistence on making the municipality into a nationalist space continues. The government attempts to prevent the Palestinians from making it into a national space, from creating spaces for national expressions, continue. The military government continues until 1966. But in all this, Nazareth leads the Palestinians who remain within Israel in an effort to insist on their identity as Palestinians and their citizenship as citizens in the state. And in these things, you repeatedly see the continuities from the mandate period. You see that it's the same people in some of the cases. Many of the communists were already active, at least the early years, were already active in the mandate period, but also the mayor and others were already leaders in the community. And they're using discourses that are very similar. And they're using ways that they have been trying to undermine their exclusion and their oppressive state, both during the mandate and during Israel. And that, I think, is something very important to remember, because it is very easy to see the Palestinian history as one that is completely broken, as one that kind of turns into this multiple histories, which there is an aspect of it. It is very hard to do the work of imagining one Palestinian history when the Palestinians were shattered into all those groups. But it is also possible to try to understand that this place, these people, this identity, didn't just disappear into thin air in 1948. People were and continue to insist on their presence. And this is where I come back to the present. The struggle of people in Jerusalem right now is an old new struggle. It's a struggle of people who basically have faced an oppressive system for years and have learned from each other's struggles and discourse to continue insisting that Jerusalem will always be Palestinians. Its people will always be in it, because that's a part of our history. Thank you.